I'm Strobe Talbott of the Brookings Institution, and I'm here with Ambassador Rick Burt in Moscow, and we're going to conduct a conversation about the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty between the United States and the Russian Federation. And this is a perfect person to be talking to all of us on this subject, because Rick, you've devoted an awful lot of your career, in fact several parts of your career, to this subject of strategic arms control, and you were instrumentally involved, of course, in the treaty that this one is replacing. So bottom line, looking at it now from the outside but knowing it very well, is this something that's in the interests of the United States?
Well, I think it's clearly in the interests of the United States, Strobe, in two important respects. It does contain some modest but important reductions in both nuclear warheads that can be delivered against both countries and in the number of delivery vehicles, missiles and bombers that the two sides deploy. So it is a continuation of a long time experience between the United States, the former Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, in reducing the nuclear threat. But secondly, it actually, in my view, puts the arms control process back on the road. You mentioned my involvement in the earlier negotiation. Well, my treaty, the one that I was involved in negotiating, was signed in 1991 by Presidents Bush and Gorbachev. And while there was some dialogue, discussion, and agreements reached between the two powers, this is really the follow-on treaty to the 1991 treaty. So it's been almost 20 years since we've had a formal process of negotiation. And so I think the big question now is, will we get this treaty ratified, and then will we continue with the Russians to seek further reductions and make other progress in the general area of arms control?
Well, there was, of course, a treaty signed between the United States and the Russian Federation under the second President Bush. Why is this called a New START treaty and not a New SORT treaty, which was the acronym they came up with for that second treaty?
Well, as you know very well, that treaty was not a formal arms control agreement. It was very general in character. It didn't contain rigorous provisions for verification, and it really built on the 1991 treaty, and was seen especially by the Russian side as the United States really not being serious about rolling up its sleeves, getting serious about the process, and attacking new emerging problems in the strategic force postures of both sides.
In your opening comment, you called these modest reductions. I know that you're very active in the Global Zero movement as well. Put this treaty into the context of that greater aspiration for a world without nuclear weapons, which of course President Obama and President Medvedev have both subscribed to.
Yeah, I was just going to say, take you back to last year when President Obama and President Medvedev met for the first time. President Obama convinced President Medvedev to sign up to the goal of Global Zero, and that was to achieve the total elimination of nuclear weapons worldwide at some distant point in the future. And I think that both the leaders see this as a first step in that process. But I think we have to recognize that even after this treaty goes into force, both the United States and the Russian Federation will deploy over 1,000 nuclear warheads. Depending on the counting rules, it could be over 2,000 nuclear warheads for both sides. And that doesn't count the so-called tactical nuclear weapons, or what the Russians call sub-strategic weapons. And the Russians are thought to possess 2,000 to 3,000 or even more of those systems. And it doesn't count the stored nuclear warheads that both countries have. And so both sides have very large nuclear inventories. Now, unilaterally, in recent years, they've begun to build down those inventories, but that's been a kind of staggered process, and it hasn't had a strategic logic to it. And so I think both sides are beginning to think even now about what would a follow-on negotiation look like, and could they possibly reduce their inventories to a low enough level where you could really take a giant step and begin a process of multilateralizing the negotiations. Maybe not in the next phase, that's very, very unlikely, but bringing in the Chinese, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the French and the British, for example, into a multilateral negotiation that would begin to move towards much lower, verifiable and politically plausible levels. When you start doing that, when you start to think about a multilateral negotiation where countries start to build down to 1,000 nuclear weapons or lower, then you begin to have an impact, in my view, on the process of nuclear proliferation.
As I mentioned at the outset, we're here in Moscow, and we've, of course, together been having conversations with authoritative Russians over the last several hours. And I've been struck, I wonder if you have as well, by the degree of skepticism, shall we say, almost sort of begrudging tolerance of the idea of elimination. In fact, my sense is that there is reluctance to go much deeper than this treaty would take us for an historically ironic reason. As I recall from our long past youth, the U.S. Nuclear deterrent was largely intended to compensate what was seen as the conventional superiority of the old Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Now one gets the feeling, listening to Russians, that they almost see their nuclear arsenal as the last real hard power strength that they have, and they need it to compensate for their inferiority geopolitically.
Yeah, I agree with that. There are three factors at work here. One is that the Russians now feel conventionally inferior, so there's been a role reversal. The West, NATO, in the Cold War period, used nuclear weapons in a sense as a crutch. The Western countries, for budgetary reasons or for other reasons, were never willing to really match the Soviet Union tank for tank, soldier for soldier. And so there was a reliance on nuclear weapons to deter any kind of Russian threat. That's changed. The Russians now feel that nuclear weapons need to compensate for their conventional weakness. A second reason, though, is geopolitical. The United States still, despite a globalized world, we live in a kind of splendid isolation. Our neighbors are Canada, Mexico. We don't face the kind of geopolitics that the Russians have to deal with, particularly with an emerging China. So the Russians are very much focused on not just a potential American threat at some point, but a regional threat from China potentially, or the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries on their periphery. And then finally, there's a technological aspect to this. They look at our precision-guided munitions. They look at the fact that the United States is now getting ready to deploy conventional warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles. They worry about our capabilities in space. They worry about ballistic missile defense. And all of these factors, I think, lead them to say, we'll talk about maybe further reductions, but we have to put new issues on the agenda as well, such as ballistic missile defense, which they've already raised, of course, in the current negotiations, but also conventional weapons that could play a strategic role. And they're worried thus about our technological advantage.
With perhaps some reason from an objective standpoint. But as you know, because we've heard it just during our brief time here, the prospects of ratification of this treaty in the Parliament are pretty much taken for granted. There doesn't seem to be a lot of suspense about what will happen on the Russian side. However, President Obama and his team have a lot of convincing to do in the Senate. What do you think the principal issues are going to be that are going to be debated in the Senate during the ratification process?
Well, I mentioned the Russian concern about ballistic missile defense. That's already reflected in the preamble of the New START Treaty, where the United States has agreed that there is a relationship between strategic offense and defense. Some of the critics of the treaty say, well, you've opened the door now to legitimizing Russian claims in future negotiations to constrain American options in the area of strategic defense. And even in some of the fine print of the treaty, we have agreed, for example, that we won't use ICBM launchers as launchers for future ABM systems, for defensive systems. And some people say, see, you're already agreeing to constrain our options in that area. So that will be a major issue of concern. Another area of concern that has been raised is that, the Russians are already by themselves building down their offensive strategic forces, simply because their defense budget is less than 10% of that of the United States. They probably won't deploy as many ballistic missile systems, launchers, and bombers as even the treaty permits. We don't know, of course. So some critics are saying, Well, why should we constrain ourselves when the Russians are unilaterally forced to reduce their forces? So that'll be another serious criticism of the treaty. But Strobe, I think there clearly aren't any sort of articles or provisions in the treaty that would seriously constrain American options. I don't think there are any important defects in the treaty, and so there will be, I think, a lot of sound and fury in this debate and discussion. But I think it's mainly designed not for this treaty, but to constrain the administration if it seeks a more ambitious treaty in the future. And for that reason, I think the treaty has a good chance of being ratified.
A more ambitious treaty in the sense of another strategic arms reduction treaty, or are you thinking about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which President Obama is also committed to trying to get ratified 11 years or whatever it's been after it was
I would say both.
last rejected by the Senate?
I would say both. I think that people are prepared to live with the levels provided by this treaty because, as I was suggesting earlier, they're modest reductions. They're not huge reductions. It doesn't do damage to any of our kind of existing nuclear posture, the triad. We're still going to have submarine-launched ballistic missiles, land-based systems, and submarines. We're still going to be able to clearly undertake any important missions. I think people will all recognize that we will have a very robust deterrent. But I think people are worried because of Obama's support for deep cuts, the idea, long-run goal of elimination, that a follow-on treaty would be a much deeper, more far-reaching agreement, and I think they want to send a signal now not to go that far in the future. But you also mentioned the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and I think that may be the most important symbolic debate about nuclear weapons within the broader area of American national security, because you're getting into the area of really beginning to say that that nuclear weapons in the future may not play a dominant role in American policy, and you're also beginning to threaten the nuclear weapons establishment, the laboratories, the whole kind of nuclear industrial complex that has designed these things, built these things, and tested these things. So that's going to be a very difficult treaty debate, and in fact, one of the issues I think the Obama administration is going to have to address is when would they want to try to get the CTBT ratified? Does he want to try to do that in this administration? Or is there a relationship between trying to get a CTBT ratified and a much more far-reaching new START negotiation launched? And I don't think they've made that decision yet.
Do you get the sense that some of the declared opponents, or shall we say extreme skeptics about the treaty, are in effect using it as a setup to attack the CTBT?
Yeah, I think they're laying down a marker on both a more radical reductions effort in the area of strategic forces after this treaty, as well as the CTBT.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned two lines of attack. This is the last question, by the way, Rick, that we can expect during the course of the debate in the Senate. One had to do with the missile defense issue. The other had to do with essentially letting rust take care of the Russian arsenal. There's, of course, the famous admonition by Ronald Reagan: trust but verify. Is there going to be any vulnerability on the issue of verification here? Because I think a lot of Americans in particular understand that intuitively. You can't trust the Russians. Can we be sure that they're complying?
Yeah, and you and I have been around, and verification is the easiest issue for people to understand. But I don't think there's a showstopper in the area of verification. We have, I think, made what was a very complicated and, by the way, expensive verification system somewhat easier. And that's particularly in the case of missile production, because right now it's only the Russians that are actually producing new missiles, this new generation of missiles that they're slowly deploying. And that process has been eased to some extent, but I have not heard a really good argument against our ability to be able to keep track of deployed Russian forces. So I haven't heard a good argument against the verification provisions of this agreement. I should say, though, there is another issue here that I failed to mention before, which will come up, and that is I mentioned it as a Russian concern, but that is the American deployment of conventional warheads on ballistic missiles, because we have agreed under this treaty because we only plan to deploy a very small handful of those systems. These are sort of the anti-Al-Qaeda weapons, where you could really very quickly strike a target with a conventional warhead, using, for instance, a Trident missile on a submarine. We are going to count those weapons as nuclear warheads. And the administration agreed on that approach because, as I say, they're only going to deploy a small number of those. But there will be some critics who will definitely come back and say these systems have great promise in the American arsenal. We shouldn't limit them in the context of this treaty, and that is going to be, I think, one of the key arguments against.
Well, Rick, in addition to thanking you, I also want to thank you and congratulate you for your own role in an enterprise that must give you some gratification to see back in business, and that is reducing the weapons of mass destruction in the arsenals of two countries that account for well over 90% of the nuclear weapons on Earth. So I can't imagine a better person to help us understand it. So,
well, Strobe, let me say one last word, and that is somebody who has followed this issue, reported about it, written some brilliant books about it, and now at Brookings, with having a staff of people who are continuing to produce excellent analysis and research on this. I have to congratulate you, too.
Well, I'm lucky to have colleagues like Steve Pfeiffer, who's here with us in Moscow, and thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, Strobe.